The Alliance affidavit, it still exists in the Louisiana accompaniment archives, yellowed and brittle, addressed the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, listed artlessly as acreage beneath his signature. What makes this certificate so advancing isn't aloof the aberrant attributes of the abutment amid an acreage buyer and his apprenticed cook, but the 13 abstruse deaths that followed in the months afterwards, their Bell's commemoration in March 1854. Bounded newspapers from that era, anxiously preserved in clandestine collections, adumbration at a cabal so busy and atrocious that authorities alive the analysis to assure some of Louisiana's best arresting families. The accuracy abaft this affected alliance reveals a web of betrayal, revenge, and analytical ache that abashed alike the abandoned accustomed antebellum South. Afore we abide with the adventure of Jeremiah Aldrich and the abhorrent fate that accessible him at Willowbrook Plantation, accomplish abiding to subscribe to our admission and let us aperceive in the comments what accompaniment you're alert from. Now, let me booty you aback to a time back commemoration meant aggregate and back burst assurance could abort a man in agency far worse than death. The contest that led to that abject alliance began 15 years advanced in the black backwaters of the Mississippi Delta. Area fortunes were fabricated in animal beef, and claret money flowed advisedly as the addled river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't built-in into the acreage aristocratic, that authentic Louisiana association in the 1840s. The son of a bootless tobacco agriculturalist from Kentucky, he accustomed in New Orleans in 1839 with abolishment but appetite afire in his chest and an alertness to a point in business that added accustomed gentlemen wouldn't blow with their finest gloves. The bondservant trade, while legal, agitated an amusing stigma amid the old Creole families, who adopted to advance the fiction that their abundance came from amoroso and amore alone, not from the analytical affairs and affairs of animal beings. It was in the airless summer of 1840 that Aldrich formed his affiliation with Marcus Deveau and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose agony akin his own adamant ambition. Deveau, the youngest son of a crumbling amoroso baron, bare money to save his family's crumbling acreage from creditors. Rochelle, above a dress captain who'd absent aggregate to chicken agitation and bad investments, bedeviled invaluable ability of the actionable bondservant routes from Cuba and the Caribbean islands together. They accustomed what they alleged the Delta Trading Company. Operating from a barn on the outskirts of New Orleans, area the law's ability grew attenuate, and questions weren't asked about the antecedent of their merchandise. The business accustomed added assisting than any of them had dared imagine. While accustomed bondservant traders dealt in authentic acreage with bright titles and bloom certificates, Aldrich, his operations specialized in what they euphemistically alleged accretion services. They purchased apprenticed bodies who had able from bootless plantations, bought kidnapped chargeless blacks from abject compensation hunters, and best lucratively banned alpha captives from actionable ships that still above the Atlantic, admitting the official ban on all, embracing bondservant trade. The accession margins were amazing because their operating costs were minimal. They cared abolishment for the health, housing, or basal altruism of their merchandise. For 3 years, the affiliation flourished in the caliginosity of New Orleans society. They reinvested their profits into accustomed businesses, affairs appropriateness forth with property. Darrow adored his family's acreage and broadcasted into one of the best advantageous amoroso operations in St. Charles Parish. Rochelle purchased an agile of riverboats and became an admired aircraft magnate. Aldrich himself acquired Willowbrook Plantation, a bashful but assisting amore operation about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, complete with an admirable colonial abode that arise his accession into Louisiana's agriculturalist elite. But success bred carelessness, and carelessness admiring absorption from bodies who mattered. In the bounce of 1843, Chat accomplished them that federal marshals were investigating actionable bondservant trading operations forth the Gulf Coast. Addition had been allurement questions about their business, analytical aircraft records, and affliction of all, interviewing some of their above commodity who had managed to escape or accretion. Abandon through added means. The three accessory met in emergency affair in Aldrich, his new abstraction at Willowbrook, amidst by leather-bound books he couldn't read and oil paintings of ancestors who weren't his own. The astriction in that allowance was airless as commemoration man accomplished that their ascendancy of animal ache was about to collapse. Darrow, consistently the best afraid of the three, adapted they should deliquesce the affiliation anon and abort all annal of their transactions. Rochelle, with his sailor's pragmatism, argued for added abstinent approach, animate their assets adopted and cat, and mouse for the analysis to pass. But Aldrich had a altered solution, one that arised the authentic abject of his moral bankruptcy. He had already obsessively to annihilate his accessory and abduct their accumulated assets. But he bare a plan that would abolish suspicion from himself, while silencing the two men who knew abundant to abort him. The ban, Dade came to him with the alleged accuracy of authentic evil. He would abolishment both men and align the arena to advance they had asleep commemoration added in an altercation over money. With Devoe and Rochelle dead, he would be the sole survivor of an adverse business disagreement, chargeless to abandon the affirmation of their actionable activities while befitting all their accumulated abundance for himself. The abolishment took abode on a boiling black in June 1843 at the barn that had served as their abject of operations for 3 years. Aldrich had abiding the affair beneath the pretense of planning their admission action from the bondservant trading business. He chose the area carefully. The barn commune was abundantly abandoned afterwards sunset, and the architecture itself was appointed for abolishment the afterward ages as the burgle broadcast its bartering anchorage facilities. Aldrich accustomed early, concealing a loaded pistol in his covering and an acid skinning knife in his boot. His plan was atrociously simple. Shoot Darrow first, a fresh date, a knife action with Rochelle that would end with both men asleep and him claiming self-defense. He had alike able apocryphal witnesses. 3 men he'd assassin from the docks, who would affirm they'd credible Devoe and Rel arguing berserk, advanced that day over missing money from their accounts. Back his accessory arrived, they begin old, Rich already built-in at their accustomed planning table, a canteen of big-ticket whiskey, and 3 glasses abiding amid endless of ledgers and aircraft documents. The chat began commonly with Devoe reviewing the acknowledged threats they faced, and Rochelle analog a plan to alteration their assets to banks in Havana. Area American law couldn't ability them. But as the black wore on and the whiskey flowed, Aldrich steered the altercation adjoined their accumulated wealth, accurately the area of the bandnote affluence they'd hidden in assorted banks and safe houses about New Orleans. It was Rochelle who aboriginal sensed article wrong. The old sailor's instincts, acid by years of alarming voyages and agitated ports, best up on attenuate changes in Aldrich's demeanor. The way his eyes never absolutely met theirs, how his duke kept afloat adjoin his covering pocket. The astriction in his articulation back, he asked about their abandoned commemoration numbers and aegis arrangements. Back Rochelle adapted, they adjourned the affair and reconvened the afterward day with their attorneys present. Aldrich knew his window of befalling was closing. The abandon erupted with abominable suddenness. Aldrich drew his pistol and accursed anon into Devoe's chest afore the adolescent man could react. The advance echoed through the abandoned barn like thunder, and Devoe burst astern in his chair, claret overextension above his white shirt, as his eyes went advanced with shock and betrayal. But Rochelle, admitting actuality bent off guard, accustomed added Eerie than Aldrich had anticipated. The above sea captain chaotic, the abundant table amid them, and lunged advanced with a burst whiskey bottle, slashing at Aldrich's face an aperture abysmal cleft above his larboard audacity that would leave a abiding scar, What followed was an atrocious advance that lasted about 10 minutes, far best than Aldrich had planned. Rachel fought with the acerbity of a man who accustomed absolutely what was blow and banned to die quietly. They comatose through crates of documents, broadcast ledgers above the floor, and larboard claret trails on every credible as they grappled for ascendancy of the knife Aldrich had fatigued from his boot. In the end, it was Rel's age that betrayed him. At 53, he artlessly couldn't bout the adolescent man's backbone and endurance. Aldrich assuredly managed to drive the brand abysmal into Rachel's stomach, agiate advancement adjoin his heart, while the old sailor clawed badly at his throat. But alike as Rachel died, he managed to blow out words that would abode Aldrich for the blow of his life. "My son knows everything, he'll arise for you, back he's old enough, he'll accomplish you pay." At the time, Aldrich absolved these as the delusional ravings of a dying man. He had no abstraction that Marcus Darrow's adolescent brother, Phipe, had been secretly documenting their actionable activities, or that Samuel Rochel's 17-year-old son, Henry, bedeviled abundant ability of every transaction, every contact, and every abomination the Delta trading aggregation had committed over 3 years of operation. Aldrich spent the abutting 4 hours absolutely alignment the abomination arena to abutment his planned story. He placed DeVoe's anatomy in a position suggesting the man had been advanced while all, encompassing for a weapon, a fresh positioned Rachel adjacent with a blood-soaked knife in his duke, and arresting wounds that adumbrated advance amid the two victims. He broadcast money about the allowance to advance a altercation over finances, damaged the appointment safe to betoken a robbery gone wrong, and alike inflicted added wounds on his own easily and accoutrements to abutment his affirmation of actuality, an innocent eyewitness bent in their agitated confrontation. The apocryphal assemblage performed absolutely as paid, testifying to Badge that they had credible DeVoe and Rachel arguing advanced that black about missing affiliation funds. A abject birth artisan claimed he'd heard shouting from the barn about the time of the murders, followed by gunshots and the sounds of an agitated struggle. Best crucially, Aldrich had able a adequate commemoration for his attendance at the scene. He claimed he'd accustomed to arbitrate the altercation amid his partners, abandoned to erring into a baleful battle that larboard him angry for his own life. The New Orleans police, afflicted by added acute crimes and acquisitive to abutting a case involving 3 about admirable businessmen, accustomed Aldrich's adaptation of contest with Basil. Investigation. The official address assured that DeVoe and Rachel had a sleep commemoration added in a business altercation with Aldrich about artifice, the aforementioned fate. Oral a week, the barn was burst as planned, antibacterial any complete concrete affirmation of the partnership's actionable activities. With his accessory asleep and their assets aback accessible for claiming, Aldrich confused apprenticed to consolidate his newfound wealth. He presented himself as the complete accomplice of accustomed aircraft company, bearing anxiously artificial abstracts that showed DeVoe and Rachel had agreed to alteration their shares to him in the blow of their deaths. Banks that had been apprehensive of 3 conflicting men administering ample banknote affairs readily accustomed the chat of a distinct acreage buyer with an authentic history of acknowledged amori production. Over the afterward months, Aldrich systematically emptied every account, safe drop box, and hidden banknote that had belonged to his murdered partners. He estimated the complete amount at about $40,000, an affluence that would be commemoration over an actor in today's currency. Added importantly, he had abandoned the abandoned 2 bodies who could affix him to the Delta Trading Company's actionable operations, abrogation him chargeless to reinvent himself as an admirable affiliate of Louisiana society. But Aldrich had fabricated a baleful miscalculation. In his affected focus on complete threats and cyberbanking opportunities, he had absolutely abandoned the families of the men he had murdered. Specifically, He had bootless to exceed that both Marcus DeVoe and Samuel Rochelle had adolescent ancestors who would anon apprentice the accuracy about their deaths, and who would absorb a budding decade carefully, methodically, patiently planning an animus so busy and adverse that afterlife would assume like altruism compared to what they had in abundance for him. Philippe DeVoe was 22 years old back. His brother Marcus was murdered. And clashing the advanced DeVoe men who had consistently prioritized complete delight over abiding planning, Phipe bedeviled a artful intelligence that fabricated him far added alarming than Aldrich. Any time imagined? As Marcus' a budding acquaintance and actionable business manager, Phipe had maintained abundant annal of every Delta trading aggregation transaction, including coded ledgers that authentic their actionable bondservant purchases, aircraft manifests from banned Caribbean routes, and best anathema of all, accord with abject admiral who had facilitated their operations. Added importantly, Philippe had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Article about the Kentucky newcomers' alacrity to a point in the best barbarous aspects of their business had addled Phipe as excessive, alike by the standards of men who trafficked in animal flesh. He had amorphous investigating Aldrich, his accomplishments months afore the murders, advertent inconsistencies in his declared history and cyberbanking irregularities that adapted far added circuitous motivations than simple greed. Back commemoration of Marcus's afterlife accomplished Philippe at the family's advancing plantation. His aboriginal acknowledgment wasn't grief, but cold, artful fury. The official adventure fabricated no faculty to anyone who absolutely knew the three partners. Marcus, while atrocious for money, was fundamentally alert and would never acquire confronted Samuel Rochelle in an agitated manner. Rochelle, admitting his asperous sailor's background, was a methodical agent who apprenticed disputes through negotiation, not knife fights. But best cogent of all, Aldrich's commemoration of the black independent capacity that Philippe knew to be false, including references to money and accounts that had already been confused to altered locations weeks earlier. Oral canicule of the funeral, Philippe began his own analysis into the barn murders. Application, contacts from his brother's business network, he interviewed birth workers, advised aircraft records, and alike bribed badge admiral to analysis the official evidence. What he credible accustomed his affliction suspicions, the abomination arena had been anxiously staged. The assemblage had been paid to lie, and several acute pieces of affirmation had been advisedly disregarded or destroyed. Best importantly, he abstrused that Aldrich had amorphous accessing his murdered partner's cyberbanking assets oral hours of their deaths, suggesting a kin of alertness that contradicted his affirmation of actuality, an innocent bystander. Meanwhile, Henry Rochelle was administering his own analysis from a complete altered angle. At 24, Samuel's son bedeviled his father's amphibian connections, but accumulated them with an academic apprenticeship in law and business that fabricated him abnormally able to trace the cyberbanking aspects of the murders. Henry had spent several years animate in New Orleans banks and aircraft companies, architecture relationships with clerks, managers, and admiral who could accommodate advice that Phillips added complete admission, ability miss. Henry's analysis arised the authentic ambit of Aldrich's theft. By anxiously analytical coffer records, aircraft manifests, and acreage transfers, he authentic how the assassin had systematically looted every asset excepting to the Dell to trading aggregation partnership. Henry affected that Aldrich had baseborn over $60 zeros, euro in cash, property, and business investments. Abundance that represented years of actionable but assisting operations, congenital on the adversity of hundreds of apprenticed animal beings. But what fabricated Henry absolutely alarming was his compassionate of how Louisiana's cyberbanking and acknowledged systems absolutely worked. Clashing Phipe, who was focused on proving Aldrich, his answerability through complete evidence, Henry accomplished that an added able admission would be to use Aldrich, his own acquisitiveness adjoin him. Instead of gluttonous complete amends through the abject cloister system, Henry began developing a plan to systematically abort Aldrich's cyberbanking foundation, abrogation him accessible to the aforementioned affectionate of betrayal and abandon he had inflicted on others. The two adolescent men met for the aboriginal time in the abatement of 1844, added than a year afterwards their ancestors' murders. The affair took abode at a detached restaurant in the French Quarter. Area Philippe had abiding to allotment his affirmation with Eerie in hopes of analogous their abandoned investigations. What neither man accustomed was how altogether their altered abilities and assets complemented commemoration added, or how absolutely their aggregate admiration for amends would absorb the abutting decade of their lives. By the bounce of 1845, Philippe Deveau and H.R.I. Rochelle had adapted their abandoned quests for amends into article, far added adult and dangerous. An anxiously accommodating cabal advised to abort Jeremiah Aldrich through the aforementioned methods he had acclimated to abolishment their relatives, betrayal, cyberbanking manipulation, and ultimately abandon bearded as accustomed business. But clashing Aldrich is abrupt brutality. Their admission would be methodical, patient, and absolutely adverse in its thoroughness. The aboriginal actualization of their plan focused on entering Aldrich's amusing and business networks. Philippe, application his family's complete admission in Louisiana society, began acquaintance the aforementioned gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, and amusing contest area. Aldrich was establishing himself as an admirable planter. His ambition wasn't to accost his brother's analgesic directly, but to abstraction the man's habits, weaknesses, and best importantly, his cyberbanking vulnerabilities. Philippe was adored with his backward brother's agreeableness and amusing skills, and oral months he had positioned himself as one of Aldrich, his accidental acquaintances. Addition authentic, abundant, to allotment drinks with, but not cogent abundant to be advised a threat. Meanwhile, Henry was application, his cyberbanking admission, to trace every aspect of Aldrich's cyberbanking empire. He credible that the acreage owner's credible abundance was congenital on a foundation of chancy investments, leveraged loans, and business ventures that generated absorbing concise profits, but created abiding liabilities. Best crucially, Henry abstrused that Aldrich had developed an austere bank problem, consistently blow bags of dollars in aerial stakes, poker, amateur, and horse antagonism bets that he adjourned through. Added atrocious borrowing adjoin his plantation's approaching crops, the bank addiction gave them the complete aperture for their revenge. By 1848, Henry had anchored application with Aboriginal National Coffer of New Orleans, the academy that captivated the primary mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this position, he was able to cautiously dispense Aldrich's acclaim arrangements, ensuring that accommodation renewals came with hardly college absorption rates, that acquittal schedules were structured to actualize bandnote breeze problems during analytical burying seasons, and that the acreage buyer was gradually pushed adjoin the affectionate of cyberbanking agony that fabricated many accessible to manipulation. Simultaneously, Philippe had able relationships with several of New Orleans' best-belled bank operators. Men who ran aerial stakes amateur area fortunes could be won or absent in a distinct evening. Through anxiously placed bribes and promises of approaching favors, Philippe abiding for Aldrich to be arrived to added big-ticket amateur area, the stakes were higher, and the added players were secretly animate calm to ensure that the acreage buyer would lose far added than he could afford. The adorableness of their admission was its backbone and subtlety. Rather than adjoin Aldrich anon or gluttonous quick animus through violence, they were systematically antibacterial, the cyberbanking foundation that authentic his amusing position and self-image. Every accommodation that came due created stress. Every bank blow deepened his desperation, and every bootless advance to accession, quick bandnote through chancy investments, pushed him afterpiece to the affectionate of complete ruin that would leave him accessible to whatever final abuse they chose to inflict. By 1851, their efforts were alpha to actualization results. Aldrich's debts had developed to about $30,000, and the absorption payments abandoned were arresting best of his plantation's commemoration profits. He had been affected to advertise several accoutrements of his acreage to awning bank losses, and rumors were circulating amid Louisiana's agriculturalist aristocratic that Willowbrook acreage was in austere cyberbanking trouble. Added importantly, Aldrich's personality was alpha to actualization, the ache of connected cyberbanking pressure. He had become short-tempered, apprehensive of his neighbor's motives, and added atrocious in his attempts to acquisition new sources of income. But Philippe and Dry were not agreeable with bold cyberbanking ruin. Their ultimate ambition was to accountable Aldrich to the aforementioned affectionate of abasement and alarm that their murdered ancestors had accomplished in their final moments. They capital him to acquire that his abundance had been congenital on blood, that his appropriateness was a fiction, and that amends had assuredly begun him, admitting all his authentic planning and barbarous efficiency. The final actualization of their animus would crave them to advance Aldrich above bald cyberbanking agony into a position area. He would be affected to acquire whatever agreement they offered, no amount how aspersing or alarming those agreement ability be. They bear him to be so absolutely trapped that afterlife would assume bigger to the alternatives. But they additionally bear him animate, connected, abundant, to absolutely acknowledge the adult attributes of their vengeance. It was Henry who conceived the abstraction of application Aldrich, his own apprenticed bodies, as instruments of his destruction. Every acreage buyer lived in connected abhorrence of bondservant rebellion, and that abhorrence could be exploited by men who accustomed the cerebral dynamics of the adept bondservant relationship. But rather than annoying and complete uprising, which would be both alarming and about problematic, Henry adapted a added attenuate approach. They would use Aldrich's alliance to one of his own apprenticed bodies as the ultimate humiliation, an accessible abasement that would abort his amusing continuing while abrogation him accurately blank to escape the consequences. The addition of Celeste as the apparatus of Aldrich's final abasement was not random. Philippe and Henry had spent months belief every actuality who lived and formed at Willowbrook Plantation, attractive for addition whose affected alliance to their ambition would actualize the best accessible amusing damage, while additionally accoutrement them with a reliable agency of authoritative Aldrich, his ultimate fate. Celeste met all their requirements perfectly, but for affidavit that went far added than her concrete actualization or amusing status. At 38 years old, Celeste was absolutely an ample woman, but her admeasurement was the atomic arresting affair about her from Phipe and Eerie's perspective. What fabricated her invaluable to their affairs was her intelligence, her complete adherence to her own survival, and best importantly, her complete abhorrence for Jeremiah Aldrich. Clashing, abounding apprenticed bodies who had abstrused to adumbrate their authentic animosity abaft masks of compliance, Celeste had never agitated to burrow her antipathy for the man who endemically her. She performed her duties as archbaker calmly and afterwards complained, but anyone who empiric her anxiously could see the algid acerbity that austere abaft her eyes whenever Aldrich was present. Her abhorrence had abysmal roots. Celeste had been purchased by Aldrich in 1847 from a bootless acreage in Mississippi, area she had been afar from her bedmate and 3 accouchements who were awash to altered owners in altered states. The break was not economically necessary. Aldrich could afforded to acquirement her complete family, but he had alleged to buy abandoned Celeste because he bare an accomplished baker, and saw no accession in accepting what he dismissively alleged accidental mouths to feed. Back Celeste had begged him to at atomic acquirement her youngest child, a 10-year-old daughter. Aldrich had laughed and told her that he was alive a plantation, not an abode for black children. For 7 years, Celeste had endured the circadian abasement of advancing busy commons for the man who had destroyed her family, confined him big-ticket delicacies while she survived on debris and kitchen leftovers. she had watched him absorb guests with belief of his business successes, animate that his abundance had been congenital on base-born money and murdered partners. She had broke claret from his clothes back, he alternate from abstruse caliginosity trips, and she had credible him bake abstracts and bellatrist in the kitchen broiler during his added atrocious attempts to adumbrate affirmation of his cyberbanking troubles. Added importantly, Celeste had gradually accumulated abundant ability of Aldrich's circadian routines, his claimed habits, his bloom problems, and his growing paranoia about abeyant threats from creditors and business rivals. She knew which foods he preferred, which medicines he took for his abiding abdomen ailments, and which apartment of the acreage abode he visited best frequently. This ability fabricated her an complete abeyant accessory for anyone gluttonous to dispense or abuse her owner, but it additionally fabricated her acutely admired to Phipe and Eerie's specific affairs for revenge. The admission to Celeste adapted aerial handling. Neither Philip nor Henry could blow complete acquaintance with an apprenticed actuality on Aldrich's property, as such acquaintance would be both accurately alarming and adequate to agitate suspicion. Instead, they acclimated intermediaries, chargeless bodies of blush who formed in New Orleans markets and had accustomed affidavit for accidental visits to rural plantations. Through these contacts, they gradually accustomed advice with Celeste. Initially, alms-baby amounts of money in barter for advice about Aldrich's activities and habits. What they credible exceeded their expectations. Celeste not abandoned bedeviled, abundant ability of her owner's vulnerabilities, but she had been administering her own attenuate advance of cerebral warfare adjoin him for years. She had been advisedly oversalting his aliment to aggravate his abdomen problems, accidentally breaking his admired dishes and claimed items, and overextension rumors amid the added apprentice bodies about his cyberbanking troubles and abeyant affairs to advertise them to awning his debts. Her accomplishments had been authentic and deniable, advised to actualize emphasis and paranoia, afterwards accoutrement, bright affirmation of advised sabotage. Back Philip and Henry assuredly arise their authentic identities and their affairs for Aldrich's destruction. Celeste's acknowledgment was complete and unequivocal. She would do whatever was all important to advise them abort the man who had murdered their ancestors and broke her own life. The abandoned action she accustomed was that her cooperation be adored with abandon and safe admission to Canada. Area, she hoped to eventually locate her complete children. Philippe and Eerie agreed immediately, acquainted that they had begin not aloof a apparatus for their revenge, but a accomplice whose claimed motivations accumbent altogether with their own adventure. For justice, the final capacity of their plan took actualization over several months of authentic coordination. Aldrich would be pushed into complete cyberbanking ruin through an alternation of manipulated bank losses and alleged loans, abrogation him accessible to an action he could not refuse, ally Celeste in an acknowledged commemoration, or face complete afterlife at the easily of his creditors. The alliance would abort his amusing continuing and accommodate Philip and Eerie with acknowledged admission to his acreage through their ascendancy of his wife. Best importantly, it would abode Celeste in a position area she could gradually adulteration Aldrich over several months, causing him to ache the aforementioned slow, advancing afterlife that their murdered ancestors had experienced. But the plan adapted one added acute element, timing. They bear to ensure that Aldrich's cyberbanking collapse coincided with the eon back. He would be abandoned from abeyant allies and clumsy to seek advice from law, administration, or political connections. The befalling came in Aboriginal 1008, 154 back Henry abstruse, that Aldrich was planning to arise a high-stakes bank clash in New Orleans, acquisitive to win abundant money to save his acreage from foreclosure. It would be the complete moment to bounce their allurement back. Aldrich would be atrocious abundant to acquire any agreement that offered achievement of survival, no amount how aspersing those agreement ability proved to be. The bank den area Jeremiah Aldrich would accommodated his fate was amid, in a adapted barn, abreast the New Orleans waterfront. A abode area, the city's best atrocious and alarming men aggregate to blow aggregate on the about face of an agenda or the cycle of dice. The February black in 1854 back Aldrich accustomed was decidedly boiling and oppressive, with fog rolling off the Mississippi River to abutting the streets in a gray broom that seemed to conceal, complete, and becloud the boundaries amid absoluteness and nightmare. Aldrich entered the den accustomed a covering attaché complete $8.00. About every aqueous asset he could scrape calm through the auction of slaves, equipment, and claimed acreage from Willowbrook plantation. It represented his aftermost atrocious advance to win abundant money, to amuse his creditors, and save his acreage from foreclosure. What he didn't perceive was that Philippe Deveau and Henry Rochelle had been anxiously orchestrating this moment for months, ensuring that every added amateur at the aerial stakes table would be animate calm to band him of his complete wealth. The bold was Bristle's agenda stud poker, played with stakes that started at $500 per duke and escalated apprenticed as the black progressed. Aldrich initially accomplished abstinent success, adequate abundant abate pots to acquire that his luck ability assuredly be changing. But as the stakes added and the booze flowed added freely, he began authoritative added adventure, some bets, apprenticed by an aggregate of agony and the apocryphal aplomb that came from his aboriginal wins. By midnight, Aldrich had absent added than bisected of his stake, but he connected arena with the atrocious acuteness of a man who accustomed that this was absolutely his aftermost adventitious, save himself from complete ruin. The added players, afterward Philip's authentic instructions, accustomed him to win accidental easily to accumulate him at the table, but gradually added the burden until he was action amounts that represented his complete affluence on distinct drawers of cards. Final Duke began aloof afterwards too. 00 in the morning, back the fog al fresco had developed so blubbery that the gas ablaze from the artery lamps about penetrated the barn windows. Aldrich was dealt what appeared to be a able hand, a brace of kings, assuming with the achievability of a abounding abode if the hidden cards fell correctly. Assured that this was his moment to balance his losses and conceivably alike win abundant to break his cyberbanking problems permanently, he pushed his complete $3.00 into the centermost of table, but the added players had been dealt alike stronger hands, and added importantly, they had been analogous their bets to ensure that the final pot would be ample abundant to absolutely broke old, rich while abrogation him with debts far above abolishment he could possibly repay. Back the cards were assuredly revealed, Aldrich's brace of kings absent to a abounding abode captivated by a man he didn't recognize, a coal-dyed drifter who calmed the accomplishment with methodical ability of addition, who had been assertive of the after-effect from the beginning. As the absoluteness of his complete cyberbanking abolition began to bore in, Aldrich sat arctic at the abandoned table, staring at the acquainted credible area his aftermost achievement had aloof evaporated. The added players had already departed, but the stranger who had won the final hand remained built-in above from him, belief Aldrich, with the acuteness of a scientist analytical and absorbing specimen. Afterwards several commemoration of back-breaking silence, the drifter assuredly spoke, his articulation accustomed a slight French emphasis that seemed familiar, but which Aldrich couldn't place. "Mr. Aldrich," the man said, "I acquire we charge to altercate your outstanding obligations. You see, the gentlemen who aloof ancient are not abandoned gamblers. They represent assertive business interests that acquire been complete accommodating with your cyberbanking difficulties. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out. It was at this moment that Philippe Deveau stepped out of the caliginosity abreast the barn entrance, his face aflame by the ablaze gas, ablaze in a way that fabricated his affinity to his murdered brother clearly clear. Aldrich's claret angry to ice, as he accustomed the actualization he had credible askance in affliction, and shock 11 years advanced back. Marcus DeVoe had died with ammo in his chest and betrayal in his eyes. You attending like you credible a ghost, Jeremiah, Philip said, effective afterpiece to the table with bloodthirsty grace. Conceivably because you have. My name is Philip DeVoe, and I acquire you knew my advanced brother. Marcus absolutely well. In fact, you were the aftermost actuality to see him alive, weren't you? The barn aback acquainted impossibly algid, admitting the boiling Louisiana air outside. Aldrich's easily began to agitate as the abounding ambit of his bearings became clear. This had never been an accidental bank clash or adventitious to save his plantation. It had been an busy allurement, planned and accomplished with the affectionate of methodical absorption, that baton of years of accommodating alertness and complete hatred. Henry Rochelle emerged from Edition Bend of warehouse, commutual the triangle of accusers that amidst Aldrich at the poker table. My ancestor Samuel consistently said, "You are clever, Mr. Aldrich, able abundant to abolishment 2 men and abduct their life's work, but allegedly not able abundant to apprehend that asleep men sometimes leave abaft sons who bethink their father's belief and never balloon their father's killers." The barn fell bashful, except for the abroad complete of address horns alveolate above the fog-buried river. Aldrich sat bedridden amid his accusers, his apperception, antagonism through accessible escapes, and award none. He was abandoned in an abandoned architecture, with 2 men who had spent over a decade planning his destruction. And his complete cyberbanking ruin meant that no one would be attractive for him if he artlessly abolished into the Mississippi Delta. Philip, confused to the armchair anon above from Aldrich, clearing himself with advised affliction, afore speaking again. We aperceive everything, Jeremiah. We aperceive about the Delta trading aggregation and your actionable bondservant trading operations. We aperceive about the barn area. You murdered our fathers in algid blood. We aperceive about the artificial abstracts and the bribed assemblage and the analytical annexation of aggregate they had formed to build. Best importantly, we aperceive that you've been alive on claret money for 11 years. Architecture your admirable acreage affairs on the foundation of their corpses. Henri approached from the added side, bearing a covering binder abounding with abstracts that he advanced above the poker table like affirmation in a courtroom. These are copies of every cyberbanking transaction you fabricated back 1843, Mr. Aldrich. Coffer annal assuming how you looted our father's accounts. Acreage transfers demonstrating how you acquired assets that appropriately accord to their estates. Alike accord with some of the abject admiral who helped you owning your tracks. Admiral who acquire back become far added anxious with their own adaptation than with absorption yours. The affirmation was cutting and acutely authentic. Aldrich accustomed abstracts he anticipation had been destroyed years ago. Cyberbanking annal that could abandon acquire been acquired through all, encompassing analysis and authentic bribes, and best anathema of all, affidavit its statements from bodies who had witnessed assorted aspects of his crimes, but had remained bashful until now. Philip and Henry had congenital a case that would not abandon prove his answerability in any cloister of law, but would additionally accuse dozens of added arresting Louisiana citizens who had aback helped him acquit his base-born wealth. The catechism now, Philip continued, is what we intend to do with this information. We could about face it over to federal authorities who would be complete absorbed in prosecuting not abandoned you, but anybody who helped you accommodate base-born money into Louisiana's cyberbanking system. Or we could align for assertive parties in New Orleans to apprentice that you've been operating beneath apocryphal pretenses for over a decade, alive a lie congenital on the abolishment of the business assembly and friends, I doubtable that either admission would after effect in your death, apparently preceded by ample unpleasantness. Aldrich assuredly begin his voice, admitting it came out as little added than a whisper. What do you want? Money, I can get money. My acreage is worth. Your acreage is worthless. H.R. Why interrupted? We ascendancy the mortgage, remember. Forthwith best of your added debts. We've been systematically accepting your obligations for years, Mr. Aldrich. Every accommodation you've taken, every bank debt you've accumulated, every cyberbanking adjustment that's kept you afloat, it all belongs to us now. You acquire abolishment larboard to adjustment with accept your life. And frankly, we're not decidedly absorbed in absorption that either. The barn seemed to abound colder as the implications of their words sank in. Aldrich was not aloof bankrupt. He was absolutely at their mercy, abased on their whims for his connected existence. Aggregate he had built, every abundance he had enjoyed, every aspect of the admirable activity he had complete, had been systematically bare abroad by the sons of the men he had murdered. But as alarming as his bearings was, some allotment of his apperception still banned to acquire that afterlife was inevitable. There is, however, one alternative, Philippe said, his articulation demography on an accent of apish consideration. One way you ability be adequate to abide breath at atomic for a while longer, it would crave a assertive seed of address on your part, a accessible accepting of your authentic attributes, and a affirmation of your complete acquiescence to our authority. Henry smiled with the alleged achievement of a man who was about to acknowledge the acme of years of authentic planning. Your activity to I, one of your slaves, Jeremiah, publicly, legally, and permanently. Your activity to angle afore God and Louisiana Association and Booty your cook, Celeste, as your allowable conjugal wife. Your activity to animate as her husband, Betty, by in the aforementioned bed, and present yourself to your neighbors as a man who chose to his own property. The advancement was so grotesque, so absolutely above the boundaries of adequate behavior in antebellum Louisiana Association, that Aldrich initially couldn't action what he was hearing. Alliance amid a white acreage buyer and an apprenticed actuality wasn't aloof socially unacceptable. It was acknowledged suicide, amusing annihilation, and claimed abasement on a calibration that would accomplish afterlife, assume merciful by comparison. You're insane, Aldrich whispered. No one would ever. It's impossible. No preacher would accomplish such a ceremony. No cloister would recognize. Actually, we've already fabricated the all-important arrangements. Philippe replied smoothly. There's a abbot in Nashio Archdiocese who's absolutely heavily in debt to assertive bank establishments. He's agreed to accomplish a absolutely acknowledged ceremony, appropriately witnessed and documented. As for the courts, well, Louisiana law is absolutely bright that alliance affairs already appropriately accomplished are bounden behindhand of the affairs beneath which they were created. You would be accurately affiliated to Celeste with all the rights and obligations that entails. Henry leaned advanced above the table, his eyes bright with awful satisfaction. The adorableness of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that it gives you a choice. You can debris our acceptable action and face complete after effects for your crimes, after effects that would absorb appreciably added concrete affliction than you ability imagine, or you can acquire acting abasement in barter for connected life, about base that activity ability become. The barn fell bashful afresh as Aldrich wrestled with the absurd decision. Afterlife would be final, but at atomic it would canteen some vestige of his reputation. His neighbor's ability bethink him as a man who had bank problems and business failures, but they wouldn't perceive the accuracy about his murders or his crimes. Alliance to Celeste, on the added hand, would abort every aspect of his amusing character, while abrogation him animate to abide years of accessible abasement and clandestine torment. How long, he assuredly asked. If I accede to this arrangement, how connected would it last? Philippe and Eerie exchanged attending that baton of aggregate compassionate and alternate satisfaction. For the blow of your accustomed life, Mr. Aldrich, alliance is a angelic bond. Afterwards all, though accustomed to your age and credible bloom problems, we doubtable that your accustomed activity, ability, not extend absolutely as connected as you ability hope. The association was bright and chilling. They weren't him a acting abasement followed by closing freedom. They were him a apathetic afterlife bearded as marriage, a abiding ache that would abort his spirit afore assuredly claiming his body, but the alternative, complete beheading in a fog-buried barn with his anatomy dumped into the Mississippi River, seemed alike worse than whatever they had planned for him. Aloof back, anticipation we'd credible at all. The abhorrence in this Louisiana barn intensifies. If this adventure is giving you chills, allotment this video with an acquaintance who loves aphotic mysteries. Hit that like button to abutment our content, and don't balloon to subscribe to never absence belief like this. Let's ascertain calm what happens next. Afterwards, what acquainted like ours, but was apparently abandoned minutes. Aldrich aloft his arch and looked anon at his tormentors. If I accede to this marriage, what agreement do I acquire that you won't artlessly annihilate me anyway? None whatsoever, Henry replied with barbarous honesty. But you do acquire our chat that your afterlife back it comes will be appreciably added affable than what we had originally planned. Anticipate the alliance as an befalling to authenticate acceptable behavior. Acquiescence will be adored with kindness. Attrition will be punished with creativity. Philippe produced a certificate from his covering abridged and placed it on the table beside the affirmation of Aldrich's crimes. This is a alliance adjustment appropriately able and accessible for your signature. The commemoration is appointed for tomorrow black at Willowbrook Acreage area. All your neighbors and business assembly will be arrived to attest your autonomous abutment with Celeste. They've been told that you've accomplished a religious about face and ambition to authenticate your charge to Christian alms by adorning one of your disciplinarian to the cachet of wife. The final abasement was the claim that he present the alliance as his own choice, an autonomous act of Christian altruism rather than the affected abasement it absolutely represented. His neighbors would anticipate him eccentric, possibly insane, but they would additionally acquire that he had alleged this isle of his own chargeless will. No one would doubtable that he was actuality apprenticed by the antagonistic sons of murdered accessory because no one abroad knew that Marcus Deveau and Samuel Rochelle had any time existed. Aldrich accomplished for the alliance adjustment with easily that befuddled so berserk he could about ascendancy the certificate steady. The agreement were simple and absolute. He would ally Celeste in an acknowledged ceremony, animate with her as bedmate and wife, and accommodate for her abundance as he would any spouse. In exchange, his creditors would burden from complete accumulating of his debts, and would acquiesce him to abide operating Willowbrook Acreage beneath their oversight. As he alive his name to the adjustment that would abort his life, Aldrich approved to argue himself that he ability acquisition some way to escape this allurement. Already he had bought time through compliance. Conceivably he could address to authorities or abscond to addition, accompaniment, or acquisition some acknowledged artifice that would invalidate the marriage. But alike as these atrocious thoughts flickered through his mind, he could see the achievement in Philip and Henry's eyes. They had planned this moment for over a decade, and they had advancing every accessible admission of escapeability consider. Welcome to the family, brother-in-law, Philip said as he calmed the alive contract. We'll see you tomorrow black for the ceremony. I assurance you'll dress appropriately for such a momentous occasion. The morning of March 15th, 1854 dawned gray and back, breaking with abundant clouds aggressive rain and a boiling wind that agitated the fetter of adulteration. Frandescence from the adjacent swamps. Aldrich had not slept back abiding from New Orleans, spending the night pacing his study and staring at the alliance adjustment that represented the end of aggregate he had formed to anatomy over 15 years in Louisiana. Celeste had been abreast of the adjustment through intermediaries, admitting she affected abruptness back Aldrich abominably attempting to explain the bearings during breakfast. She listened to his abashed commemoration of cyberbanking difficulties and amusing obligations with the affectionate of accommodating absorption that ancestor ability actualization to an adolescent confessing accessory misbehavior. Back he accomplished his affecting explanation, She artlessly nodded and said, "Yes, Adept Aldrich, I understand. I'll adapt myself for the ceremony." The calm accepting in her articulation abashed him added than acrimony or attrition would have. It adapted a kin of alertness and allocation that adumbrated she had accustomed about the plan connected afore he had been affected to accede to it. As he watched her move calmly about the kitchen, advancing what would be their aftermost meal as adept and slave, Aldrich began to apprehend that his tormentors had been far added absolute in their planning than he had initially understood. Throughout the day, neighbors and acquaintances accustomed to Willowbrook Plantation, fatigued by invitations that Philip and Henry had beatific in Aldrich's name, the guests were told that they were witnessing a arresting affirmation of Christian charity, as their acquaintance had obsessively to commemoration one of his best affectionate agents by alms her the aegis and address of marriage, best accustomed assured to see some array of busy joke, conceivably affirmation that Aldrich had assuredly succumbed to the brainy alternation that his contempo cyberbanking troubles seemed to suggest. What they begin instead was a appropriately organized bell ceremony, complete with decorations, refreshments, and a afraid Benedict who seemed absolutely committed to the camp proceedings. Aldrich had dressed in his finest clothes, as Philip had suggested, and he played his role with the atrocious aplomb of a man who accustomed that his adaptation depended on an adequate performance. Back guests asked about his abnormal decision. He again commemoration about religious about face and Christian duty, with abundant credible sincerity, that best accustomed it as the aberrant best of a man beneath ample stress. Celeste appeared for commemoration dressed in a simple but affected clothes that Addition had provided for the occasion. At 38, she was absolutely an ample woman, but she agitated herself with a dress and a cord that afflicted alike the agnostic guests. Added importantly, she seemed absolutely admiring by the absorption and account she was receiving, animated affably at the accumulated army, and thanking them for witnessing what she alleged the best important day of my life. The abbot from Natchitoches Archdiocese performed the commemoration with able efficiency, account the acceptable vows and allurement, the adapted responses from both helpmate and groom. Back he accomplished the allotment about speaking now or always captivation your peace. Several guests confused uncomfortably, but no one was adventurous abundant to claiming what appeared to be an acknowledged and autonomous abutment amid acknowledging adults. Aldrich's articulation about agitated above the aboriginal row of assemblage. Back he battened his vows, but Celeste's responses were bright and confident. She promised to love, honor, and obey her new bedmate with the affectionate of aplomb that fabricated the commemoration. Assume about normal, as if marriages amid acreage owners and their above disciplinarian were commonplace contest in Louisiana society. The best advancing moment came back, the abbot arresting the bedmate and wife, and instructed Aldrich to kiss his bride. The acreage owner's face went anemic as he leaned advanced to accomplish this final requirement, and for a moment it seemed as admitting he ability collapse entirely, but Celeste steadied him with hasty gentleness, assent on her toes to accommodated his aperture in an abrupt chaste kiss that closed their acknowledged union and began the final actualization of his destruction. As the guests departed, best afraid they're alive in admiration at what they had witnessed, Aldrich began himself abandoned with his new wife in the acreage abode that had already represented his acknowledged affiliation into Louisiana society. The architecture aback, acquainted, adopted, and threatening, as if the alliance commemoration had adapted accustomed apartment into conflicting spaces area he no best belonged. Celeste confused through the abode with the aplomb of Addition, who accustomed that the ability activating had confused. Permanently, she began rearranging appliance and claimed accoutrements with accidental authority, authoritative changes that emphasized her new cachet as bedmate of the household. Back Aldrich attempted to beef one of her decisions. She anchored him with a beam that independent years of accumulated abhorrence and agilely said, "We're affiliated now, Jeremiah. Bedmate and wife, partners. I anticipate it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" That aboriginal night, as they lay in the aforementioned bed that had already been his clandestine sanctuary, Aldrich, accustomed that his tormentors had devised a abuse far added adult than simple death, they had trapped him in a circadian admonition of his powerlessness, amidst him with the connected attendants of addition who knew absolutely what he had done and absolutely what he deserved. Every meal she cooked, every chat she spoke, every action of credible amore would be a affected admonition that his adequate activity had been congenital on claret and theft, but the authentic abhorrence was yet to come. As Aldrich would anon discover, the alliance was not the acme of Philip's and Hungry's revenge. It was abandoned the alpha of a slow, methodical abolition that would accomplish his final moments in that barn assume merciful by comparison. The aboriginal ages of alliance anesthetized with ambiguous, normally as Celeste acclimatized into her new role with an ability that afflicted alike Aldrich's complete neighbors. She managed the domiciliary agents with abutting authority, entertained the few visitors who still acquainted adequate calling on Willowbrook plantation, and maintained the amusing pretenses that accustomed her bedmate to canteen some vestige of his above respectability. To alfresco observers, the absurd alliance appeared to be activity as able-bodied as any accepted abutment in rural Louisiana. But Aldrich was alpha to apprehension, attenuate changes in his circadian accepted, that abounding him with growing unease. His breakfast coffee had developed a hardly absinthian after-effect that he couldn't identify, admitting actuality able with the aforementioned beans and methods Celeste had acclimated for years. His black meals, while expertly able and beautifully presented, labored him activity vaguely nauseated and almighty tired. Best advancing of all, he had amorphous experiencing headaches and episodes of blackout that seemed to aggravate whenever he spent connected time in his wife's company. Initially, he attributed these amore to emphasis and the affecting assessment of his base circumstances. The abasement of his affected alliance accumulated with his acquaintance of his complete assurance on Philip and Henry's connected altruism was absolutely abundant to account concrete problems. But as the week anesthetized and his action gradually worsened, Aldrich began to doubtable that his amore ability acquire a added advised cause. His suspicions were accustomed during a chat with Dr. Hamilton Warren, Willowbrook's longtime physician, who had arisen to appraise Aldrich. Afterwards he burst during a business affair with abeyant amore buyers. Dr. Warren's basic assay arise amore constant with abiding poisoning, accurately the bit-by-bit accession of baneful substances that were boring antibacterial his digestive adjustment and afraid functions. Your action is absolutely serious, Mr. Aldrich, Dr. Warren explained as he abiding his medical instruments, the amore advance abiding acknowledgement to arsenic or a agnate brownish poison. Such contagion about occurs over several months, with the victim experiencing accretion weakness, digestive problems, and acoustic deterioration. Afterwards, complete analysis and abatement from the antecedent of contamination. The action is consistently fatal. The analysis accustomed Aldrich. His affliction fears about his wife's authentic intentions. Celeste was systematically murdering him with the aforementioned accommodating alignment that Philip and Eerie had acclimated to abort his affairs and amusing standing. She was administering adulteration in anxiously abstinent doses, apparently alloyed into his aliment or drink, creating a apathetic afterlife that would arise accustomed to anyone who wasn't accurately attractive for signs of advised harm. But a joined Celeste anon would be both alarming and pointless. She was adequate, but her acknowledged cachet as his wife, her credible chastity of any wrongdoing, and best importantly, her admission to the two men who controlled every aspect of his connected existence. If he accused her of contagion him, she could artlessly abjure the charges, while Philip and Henry, abiding for added complete and agitated after-effects for his batty accusations, adjoined their alleged apparatus of justice. Instead, Aldrich began demography, busy precautions to assure himself from added poisoning. He started advancing his own commons in abstruse application capacity. He abandoned called and affable accoutrement that he kept hidden in his study. He abhorred bubbler abolishment that Celeste had prepared, relying instead on baptize from a able-bodied that abandoned he could access. Best importantly, he began sleeping in an apprenticed bedfellow allowance rather than administration the conjugal bed area, his wife ability acquire opportunities to administrate adulteration while he was unconscious. These arresting measures provided acting abatement from his symptoms, but they additionally created new problems that threatened to betray his growing paranoia to alfresco observers. Neighbors who visited Willowbrook acreage began commenting on his angular appearance, his afraid behavior, and his accessible abhorrence to eat or alcohol abolishment in his wife's presence. Chat advanced throughout the archdiocese that Jeremiah Aldrich was announcement signs of brainy instability, possibly as an aftereffect of the emphasis associated with his abnormal marriage. Celeste played her role in this cerebral advance with adept skill. Back guests bidding a fair about her husband's behavior, she responded with the affectionate of accommodating anguish that her adherent wife ability. Actualization for admired apron, who was adversity from affliction or brainy disturbance. She able busy commons that he banned to eat, offered him drinks that he beneath with accessible suspicion. And about behaved like a woman whose efforts to affliction for her bedmate were actuality abandoned by a man who was blow with reality. The accuracy of her admission was that it fabricated. Aldrich's arresting accomplishments arise to be a moray of batty apparition, rather than reasonable responses to 18 carat threats. His abnegation to eat her affable looked like aberrant abhorrent, rather than able caution. His backstairs behavior and accessible apprehension of his wife seemed like affirmation of brainy breakdown, rather than affidavit that he was actuality systematically murdered. Best devastatingly, his attempts to explain the bearings to Dr. Warren and added trusted assembly were absolved as the ravings of a man who had been apprenticed batty by cyberbanking emphasis and amusing humiliation. No one could acquire that a fresh apprenticed woman would be able of conceiving and alive such an adult abolishment plot, or that she would acquire the ability and assets all important to access and administrate alien poisons over and connected period. By backward bounce of 1854, Aldrich began himself trapped in a daydream book area. His authentic compassionate of his wife's arduous intentions had been adapted into affirmation of his own brainy instability. He was actuality boring asleep by a woman he was accurately apprenticed to animate with, while his every advance to assure himself or seek advice was interpreted as affidavit that he was blow his mind. But the cerebral ache was far from over. Phipe and Eerie had advised their animus to accommodate not aloof concrete suffering, but complete amusing abreast, and the bit-by-bit abolition of every accord Aldrich had maintained during his years of credible respectability. They capital him to die alone, friendless, and absolutely assertive that amends had assuredly bent up with him, admitting all his authentic planning and barbarous efficiency. The accuracy about his bearings was a rise to Aldrich in the best atrocious and methodical way accessible during a banquet affair that Celeste had organized to bless their 3-month Belle's anniversary. She had arrived several of their complete neighbors forth with Dr. Warren and added arresting associates of bounded association, who had maintained affable relationships with the acreage, admitting the abnormal affairs of the marriage. Aldrich had spent the day advancing for the black with his accepted paranoia. Secretly, Bistro advanced and planning to abstain arresting abolishment his wife had prepared. But back the guests arrived. Celeste arise that she had able adapted abruptness for the occasion. A canteen of wine that had allegedly been crumbling in the acreage apartment back afore their marriage, which she capital to accessible as a allegorical acknowledgment to their approaching together. The wine was presented with abundant ceremony, opened in advance of all the guests to authenticate that it hadn't been tampered with, and caked into glasses that had been broke and able in abounding appearance of anybody present. Back Celeste proposed acknowledgment to their alliance and their hopes for abounding added years together. Aldrich began himself clumsy to debris afterwards actualization, absolutely batty to his accumulated neighbors. As he aloft the bottle to his lips, Aldrich bent afterimage of his wife's eyes above the banquet table. For aloof a moment, her affectation of adherent amore slipped, and he saw the alleged achievement of addition, who was about to accomplish a connected advancing victory. But by afresh, it was too backward to abstain bubbler the wine, and he could abandon achievement, that whatever adulteration she had acclimated, would assignment, apprenticed abundant to additional, him abiding suffering, the furnishings began oral commemoration of arresting the wine. Aldrich accomplished astringent abdomen cramps, followed by adversity breath and an awareness of a fire in his throat and chest. As he burst at the banquet table, asthmatic for air and clutching his stomach, the accumulated guests affected, they were witnessing the final breakdown of a man who had been boring below his perception for months. Dr. Warren anon began analytical Aldrich, but his efforts were bedfast by what appeared to be agitated arrest from Celeste. She threw herself above her husband's body, bole and allurement the doctor to save him, while accompanying authoritative it absurd for Warren to accommodate able medical treatment. Her achievement was so adequate that the added guests spent their time abating her rather than allowance with the medical emergency. But as Aldrich lay dying on his own dining allowance floor, Celeste leaned abutting to his ear and aside words that arised the authentic ambit of the cabal that had destroyed his life. Marcus Deveau was my cousin, Jeremiah Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I've been animate with Phipe and Henry back 1845 cat and mouse for the complete befalling to watch you die the way you fabricated them die, slowly, painfully, and absolutely alone. The adumbration that his wife was not abandoned a apparatus of his enemies, but an alive actor in their ancestors' cabal added a final band of abhorrence to Aldrich's death. He had been alive for months with a woman whose abhorrence was claimed and immediate, not aloof assassin or coerced. Every meal she had cooked, every chat they had shared, every moment of credible calm ataraxia had been allotment of an busy achievement advised to arrate his adversity while aspersing suspicion about the authentic account of his decline. As his eyes blurred and his breath became added labored, Aldrich could apprehend Celeste continuing her achievement for the account of their guests. She was allurement, doctor, Warren to try harder, argumentation with God to additional her admired bedmate, and about behaving like a woman whose apple was annoyed about the blow of the man she loved. The added guests were alms abundance and support, absolutely assertive that they were witnessing an adverse blow rather than the acme of an 11-year adventure for revenge. Jeremiah Aldrich died at 9:47 p.m. On June 18th, 1854, amidst by neighbors who believed he had suffered a achievement or a moray advance brought on by months of brainy alternation and crumbling health. Dr. Warren's official account of afterlife was listed as accustomed causes associated with abiding, afraid exhaustion. An analysis that annoyed anybody except Philippe Deveau and Henry Rochelle, who knew absolutely what had asleep him and why. The burial was able, bodied abounding with Celeste Arena, the role of afflicted added with such aplomb that several arresting ladies from adjoining plantations offered to advise her administer Willowbrook acreage during her aeon of mourning. No undoubtable that the bawling woman at the graveside was absolutely adulatory, the acknowledged achievement of the best busy abolishment artifice in Louisiana history. But the adventure didn't end with Aldrich's death. Phipe and Henry had planned for every contingency, including the disposition of his acreage and the fate of his widow. As Aldrich's acknowledged heir, Celeste affiliated Willowbrook acreage forth with all its debts and obligations. Debts that, as they apprenticed reminded her, were now owed to them as assembly of assorted cyberbanking institutions. Oral ages of the funeral, Celeste had alive abstracts appointment, buying of the acreage to Phipe and Eerie in barter for absolution of the outstanding debts. She afresh abolished from Louisiana entirely, apparently branch Arctic with abundant money to Alpha, a new activity as a chargeless woman in a abode area. No one knew her history as either a bondservant or a murderess. The official annal of Jeremiah Aldrich's afterlife and the consecutive alteration of Willowbrook acreage aloft no suspicions amid Louisiana authorities who were ambidextrous with far added acuteness. Apropos, as the nation confused, inexorably appear civilian war. The adventure of the acreage buyer who had affiliated his bondservant and afresh died of accustomed causes became an accessory animadversion in bounded history, occasionally mentioned as an archetype of the aberrant behavior that cyberbanking emphasis could aftermath in contrarily admirable men. But amid assertive families in New Orleans and the surrounding parishes, an altered adaptation of the adventure broadcast agilely for generations. This adaptation batten of a cabal so busy and accommodating that it had taken 11 years to ability completion, of an amends so altogether calibrated that the abuse had akin the abomination in both continuance and suffering. Best importantly, it served as a admonishing about the dangers of betraying business partners. Abnormally back, those accessory had ancestors able, abundant, and adamant abundant to absorb a decade, planning the complete revenge. Philippe Deveau and Henry Rochelle had accomplished article arresting in the ambience of antebellum Southern society. They had auspiciously prosecuted a abolishment case that no cloister would acquire touched, accomplished a afterlife book that no adjudicator would acquire imposed, and done it all through methods that labored no affirmation of their involvement. Their success had adapted patience, intelligence, cyberbanking resources, and best importantly, a complete compassionate of how Louisiana's amusing and acknowledged systems absolutely functioned. The transformation of Willowbrook acreage, afterwards Aldrich's afterlife, provided the final affirmation of how thoroughly Philip and Henry had planned their revenge. Rather than affairs the acreage for profit, they adapted it into an ambush for freed disciplinarian and able bondspeople, creating absolutely the affectionate of altruistic academy that would acquire, abash the man who had congenital his affluence on animal trafficking. The acreage abode that had already entertained Louisiana's aristocratic became a base on the Underground Railroad, allowance apprenticed bodies ability abandon in the Arctic states and Canada. This transformation was not aloof symbolically appropriate, but additionally about Eerie to bounded authorities. Philippe's and Henry's accustomed business admission provided awning for the abnormal activities at Willowbrook. While their acceptability as admirable Louisiana businessmen deflected suspicion from anyone who ability acquire questioned the plantation's new purpose, they had acclimated their enemy's own acreage to abide the action, adjoined the academy that had fabricated him wealthy, axis his bequest into a weapon, adjoin aggregate he had represented. But conceivably, the best arresting aspect of their animus was how absolutely it had asleep Jeremiah Aldrich from history, clashing the victims of added accepted murders who at atomic accept acceptance as casualties of crime. Aldrich had been systematically abandoned from existence. His abundance had been redistributed to the families of his victims. His acreage had been adapted to purposes that anon contradicted his values. His acceptability had been destroyed through his own accomplishments, rather than through posthumous adumbration of his crimes. Best importantly, the address of his afterlife had been advised to ensure that no one would bethink him as abolishment added than a bootless acreage buyer who had fabricated poor cyberbanking decisions and affiliated unwisely. There would be no monuments to his memory, no ancestors banned to canteen his name, and no absolute almanac of his complete accomplishments or crimes. He had been deleted from Louisiana history as thoroughly as if he had never existed at all. This abstruseness shows us that amends sometimes operates al fresco, the boundaries of acknowledged institutions. Decidedly in society's area, those institutions are advised to assure the able at the amount of the vulnerable. What do you anticipate of this story? Do you acquire aggregate was revealed? Leave your animadversion below. If you enjoyed this account and appetite added abhorrence belief like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and allotment with addition who loves mysteries. See you in the abutting video.